Hi, this is Simon Black, and this is episode 5 of our brand new Sovereign Man podcast. In case you missed the first 4 episodes, you can download those at our website, sovereignman.com. And I want to start today, let's go back in time for a little bit. I want to go back to February 1768. And if you're looking at the video version of this, you're looking at what is the cover, or was the cover of London Magazine, also known as Gentleman's Monthly Intelligencer. Sounds very fancy. And this was a magazine that had been printed in England for centuries ago, really. And I was able to go back and actually find these back issues from the 1700s. And what's very interesting is this is the February 1768 edition. There's a lot of interesting articles. There's an original article. It was penned as a letter from Jean-Jacques Rousseau that was published in this edition. Of course, Rousseau was the writer of The Social Contract, very famous Swiss-born French political philosopher. There's also a rather interesting article about the medicinal benefits of chamomile. But the reason I point this out, February 1768, on page 88, they transcribed a speech that was given by a very famous English politician of the day. His name was Charles Pratt, also known as, he was the first Earl of Camden, so he's often called Lord Camden. And a very famous politician. This was a speech that Pratt had given on the topic of a recent law that had been passed called the Declaratory Bill of the Sovereignty of Great Britain over the Colonies. Of course, that sounds very fancy. But basically what that bill is about is sort of a decree that the English government, the English king said, you know what, we're the sovereign, you're the colonies, we can do whatever we want, you have to listen, you have no say in it, shut up and sit down. And that was basically it. And for them, it was sort of a way to save face, because a few years before they had passed the Stamp Act. And if you know your history, you know the Stamp Act didn't really have anything to do with the Postal Service so much as it did sort of official documents, public documents, the printed documents, all these sorts of things. After the Stamp Act, they had to be printed on these special paper that carried an official seal that was printed in England and shipped over to the colonies. Of course, there was a much higher price for this, and all that extra revenue went to the English government. It was basically a tax. And this was something that infuriated the colonists, really infuriated the colonists. And this was a time, this decree that they made a few years later, this was their way of sort of saving face. They had to sort of they had to repeal the Stamp Act. But at the same time, while repealing the Stamp Act, they said, okay, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but, you know, you're the colonies and we're the sovereign, so you have to do everything that we say. So it was sort of their way of saving face. And Lord Camden, Charles Pratt, he made a rather interesting speech. And at the top of page 89, when they were reprinting this in London Magazine, 4 words were printed on the headline. And these 4 words became, in many ways, you could almost call this the rallying cry of the pre-revolutionary period in the United States. It was one of the primary reasons why so many of the founding fathers and many people in the colonies were pushing for massive change and revolt and revolution. And these 4 words were no taxation without representation. And this is something that to the colonists was incredibly important, because at the time they were getting taxed left and right. Of course, the Stamp Act was something that really infuriated them, leading guys like Benjamin Franklin to say, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except, of course, you know, death and taxes. One of the most famous quotes probably in American history, death and taxes. I have to tell you, this was something that has happened so many times throughout history. It happened in the Romans, it happened in the Ottoman Empire. It happened here now. The British government was taxing the colonists in a way that was, for the colonists, it was infuriating. They were getting taxed in so many different ways, taxed on duties and exports, and you know, the stamp. This was something that just over a couple of years. And the reason this was happening was because the British government was engaging in this worldwide military folly, trying to keep the empire together, war against the French, and all these things. This was expensive, and they had to come up with revenue somehow. So what do? They taxed the colonists. And the colonists felt like this was incredibly unfair, because they did not have any representation in the English Parliament at the time. And in his speech, Charles Pratt, the Earl of Camden, he quotes John Locke. John Locke was obviously one of the great political philosophers, was very influential in the thinking of the Founding Fathers. A lot of Locke's principles were they're obvious in the Constitution. You can see John Locke's fingerprints all over the Constitution, even though he wasn't really alive at the time. He was a very influential figure for the Founding Fathers in the framing of the Constitution. And Pratt quotes John Locke in his speech, and he says, quote, "The supreme power," in this case the government, "cannot take from any man any part of his property without his consent." And that's really what no taxation without representation means. If you take somebody's property without his consent, it's theft. If he gives you his consent, then he gives you his consent, or her consent. I'm not trying to be gender biased here, but I'm just quoting Locke. So again, the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his consent. And the consent in this particular system comes from the people, comes from their representation, comes from their politicians and so forth that they freely elect, and that was distinctly lacking for the colonists. And this became just a tremendous issue for them that propelled them into the pre-revolutionary days and eventually gave way into the American Revolution. When you look at the American Revolution, in many ways it constitutes one of the largest sort of tax-motivated divorces in history. This was a group of people that were being taxed and taxed and taxed, and they couldn't take it anymore, and they said, you know what, we're going to divorce ourselves from our country, in that case England, and they created their new country in that case. And there was enough of them, didn't happen on an individual basis, it happened on a colony-wide basis, on a national basis at the time, and they formed their own federal republic. Fast forward a couple hundred years, 1927. One of the most famous Supreme Court justices to ever live, his name was Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He's had a fairly famous father as well. In a court case that was settled 21 November 1927, actually it was against the Collector of Internal Revenue. It's a precursor to the Internal Revenue Service. And Holmes wrote in his dissenting opinion something that's also a relatively famous phrase: taxes are what we pay for a civilized society. There are a lot of variations on that. Sometimes you hear things like taxes are the price we pay for living in a civilized society, these sorts of things. And there's a variation of this that's actually quoted and printed and enshrined in the entryway to the Internal Revenue Service office on Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C. I find that whole thing relatively ironic, given that taxation wasn't really part of the Constitution to begin with. But that's not really the point. Taxes are the price we pay for living in a civilized society. That's an interesting quote, and it leads to this question. Okay, well, that is let's just assume that that's true for a moment. Taxes are the price we pay. You hear these people say that. I've heard this a lot in the United States. People say, "Oh, it's a privilege to pay taxes in the United States." Let's just assume that's true. There's another quote that comes to mind, this one from Warren Buffett. Obviously, Buffett, one of the most famous investors in the world, probably in all of history, going all the way back to Crassus in the Roman Empire, another relatively very famous ancient investor. Buffett says, "Price is what you pay, value is what you get." And what does he mean? Well, in his case, he's making investments. And what Buffett likes to do, he likes to buy companies for less than they're really worth. Buffett likes to buy $1, but only pay 50 cents. He's famous for driving all around Omaha looking for the best deal on cherry Coke. I mean, this is a guy that wants a good deal. And let's be honest, who doesn't want a good deal? Who wants to go, and pay, $5,000 for a Big Mac? Or in the case if you go to Norway and pay $8 for a Big Mac. We'd rather go to Ukraine and pay $1.80 for a Big Mac, which is basically what it costs. Everybody wants a good deal. In many cases, and I think a lot of people understand this, the issue never really comes down to, when we're talking about goods and services and things like that, the issue never really comes down to price. It comes down to value. Are you getting value for your money? If you're getting value for what you're paying, most people don't really have a problem with that. $10,000 might sound like a lot of money for something, but if you're paying $10,000 for a brand new Ferrari, that's a great deal, right? Who wouldn't take that deal? If you're paying $10,000 for a skateboard, that doesn't sound like such a great deal. So again, it's really, things are more about price than value. So keep this in mind as we think about taxes, because Holmes is saying, okay, taxes are the price that we pay for living in society. Okay, but let's think about price and let's think about value. So first, let's look at value. Well, value, if you're looking at our video here, this is a chart essentially of the overall amount of expenditure the U.S. government basically going. I mean, it barely registers. I mean, we're talking zero. This is in millions of dollars, so it doesn't even register on the chart until you get basically into the 1970s or so, when it actually gets to be a blur. But now the U.S. government spending $3.6 trillion, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. This is a number that wouldn't even have been fathomable even 100 years ago. So it's just really absurd. This is this is really this is just the overall amount. This is the volume that we're really talking about here. But value, what do they get in the land of the free? Getting Obamacare, you're getting war, endless war, dropping bombs, drones, the National Security Agency spying on people. You get debt. That's what you get. That's the value that you're getting for your taxes. You're getting debt. There's unborn generations now that are $17.5 trillion in debt, and that's just the official total public debt. This doesn't even allow for the unfunded liabilities, all the ways that Social Security is completely insolvent and so forth. And by the U.S. government, I've mentioned this so many times, but it's because it's important. The U.S. government's own accounting statements. You look at the GAO. Every year they put out sort of financial statements as if the U.S. government were a business, which it's not because it would be out of business if it were. The U.S. government's financial statements basically they have a balance sheet which takes all the assets, the highway system, all the tanks and all the bullets and all the aircraft carriers, that they call property, plant, and equipment in accounting speak. The national parks, their strategic oil reserves, all those assets, right? Then they subtract the liabilities. The liabilities are things like the national debt, their pension obligations to federal retirees or military retirees, or the Social Security and Medicare and all these things, and they bring all that together and they subtract it. Assets minus liabilities equals sort of the net worth, and it's minus $17 trillion. So even when you include the assets, you're talking about being insolvent to the tune of $17 trillion. That's the value that you're getting. So you're paying all these taxes, and the value that you're getting is a negative net worth that your children and your grandchildren will inherit. Well, then you think about the price. Of course, this is a little chart, something that my team and I put together actually today just for this. This is, I went and looked up, of course, the taxes in the United States, U.S. Income taxes are a relatively new phenomenon. The U.S. has been around since 1776. Taxes have really only been around for the last 100 years. There are a few instances in the 1800s where they had some taxes. They were repealed almost as fast as they were introduced. But the taxes as they exist today have been around since 1913. So this is roughly the last 100 years or so of taxes. When taxes were first introduced, guess what the marginal tax rate was? 1%. 1%, that's it. And the really interesting thing about it is that if you sort of adjust for inflation, what I've done here is essentially show this is what the marginal tax rate would be on $100,000. So let's say you're a wage earner, you're making $100,000 a year in income, you're filing single. This is what the marginal tax rate would be on an inflation-adjusted basis. And so obviously, if you're making $100,000 in 1913, that would be, tens of millions of dollars today. But if we adjust for inflation, basically, this would be the tax rate. So if you were making $100,000, whatever that amount was back in 1913, your tax rate would be 1%. And it stayed, relatively low for a very, very long time. And all of a sudden, obviously, we had the Depression, we had World War II. That was a huge increase. The tax rates went up, skyrocketed. One of the things that people like to say is, you hear the big tax guys always talk about this. They point to this period in history where they say, well, the taxes were as high as 91%, back in the 40s and 50s and so forth. Yeah, that's true. But on an inflation-adjusted basis, the marginal tax rate would kick in basically on an inflation-adjusted basis when somebody was making, 90 some odd million dollars a year. Obviously, not a whole lot of people doing that, but people talk about this and they say, "Oh, yeah, taxes were like 90% back in the 50s." No, that's really not true. I'm not saying that they were low, but they were much, much lower than 90%. Anyhow, this is a graph of essentially what the price is and what the price has been over the last 100 years. They've been up, they've been down. Right now, they're probably around in their historic mean. But obviously, they're in a position right now where they're going up, and they've just gone up. Capital gains tax rates went from 15% to somehow 23%. This is basically proportionally a 50% tax increase in just 1 year. I mean, this is an astounding increase, and really tells us that they're more than happy to just take the gloves off and keep ratcheting that up to a much, much higher level. The thing that you have to ask yourself is resistance to that unpatriotic? If you don't like paying taxes, is it unpatriotic to want to resist taxes? Is it unpatriotic to not want to pay taxes? Is it unpatriotic to want to do something to actually reduce your tax burden? Is that unpatriotic? I would say no. In fact, there's a long-standing historical tradition of the Founding Fathers themselves saying, we don't want to pay these taxes, and we're going to do something about it. They went so far as to actually create a revolution to divorce themselves from their government and create a new one in its place. So, is the question really is it equally unpatriotic? Well, this is actually an interesting, I have to talk about this. We're told that it's actually our duty, that it's our patriotic duty to pay taxes. This was a vidcap from an old propaganda video from decades and decades ago in the United States, when they were first introducing income taxes, and particularly around World War II, they were saying, oh, you got to pay those taxes. If you don't pay your taxes, then the Nazis are going to win, and you're not doing your patriotic duty. It was all they wrapped all this stuff up in patriotism. Of course, we see the same sorts of things today. We see this in, I think it was last year, they did this in Italy, for example, where the government was flat broke and they had to issue bonds. And so they went out and they told all the Italians, it's your patriotic duty to buy, to loan us your savings, essentially. So they got all the Italian people to go out and give the government their money, loan the government their money, and they said it's your patriotic duty. We're told that it's our patriotic duty to pay taxes. But again, you go back to the founding fathers, you go back to the people that were the colonists in the late 1700s, and for them they said, no, this isn't patriotic, this is absurd. This is absolutely absurd. We don't want to do this. And the Stamp Act and many of the taxes they had on sugar and all sorts of things were vilified and denounced, and all the many of the print publications at the time were against this. And so again, to think that. To go from founding fathers and the colonists knowing that this isn't patriotic, this is absurd, to sort of brainwashing to say that, oh, it's our duty, it's the price we pay for living in civilized society, it's our it's a privilege to pay. This is the sort of propaganda that's put out there to make people really honestly believe this. And again, it's not about the price. And I don't know, there's a whole lot of people that necessarily argue with some sort of services. Some people are completely against it 100%. I may be one of those people. And others I think would take a more balanced approach and say, look, I don't, this isn't the worst thing in the world. I just want to make sure that I'm getting something for this. And there's a lot of low tax places out there, Singapore, Hong Kong. We talk about these places all the time where they have low taxes, where they don't tax you 2, 3, 4 times on the same income, where they are actually fair and reasonable, where they don't criminalize their tax code. Where if you're found sort of in the land of the free, if you owe taxes in their sole discretion, this is something that can very quickly turn into a criminal matter. And the United States is one of the only countries in the world where this is the case. In other places, it's a civil matter. It's an administrative matter. You sit down, you negotiate, you talk, you have documentation and so forth. In the United States, they give you a Day-Glo orange jumpsuit and have you turn big rocks into little rocks if they think that you owe taxes in their sole discretion. They put people in jail for this. So again, there are these places in the world where this exists, where they have a low tax environment, where they provide valuable services. Singapore is a very interesting place for this. It's very flat, transparent, easy place to do business. They set up these services, and the government looks at itself as a, this used to be the thing in the United States and many countries in the West, and it's gone far away from this, but they actually view themselves as existing to provide services for the people and not the other way around, not the people existing to support the government. And this is how many great empires always end up. They start off providing services and exist to provide services for the people, and then it's always turned on its head, where the people are there to pay taxes to support the bureaucracy. And of course, that's how it's become in many parts of the West, but there are still many places in the world where that's not the case, where they run these very low tax or even flat tax places where they provide services. They provide basic services for people, and people feel like, I'm paying 10% and I'm getting value for that. When you're paying 30, 40, 50%, it's hard to say that you're really getting a lot of value when they take 50% of your income and they drop bombs on people, and they pass legislation to say, oh, we can imprison you on U.S. soil, put you in military detention in our sole discretion without trial. It's hard to say you're really getting a lot of value when you're paying 50% of your income into that system. So let's think about this in terms of a patriotic perspective. This is a map from the Tax Foundation. This is a couple years old, but the point is still the same. There's places within the United States. There's federal income tax, obviously, and there's state income tax. In many places, there's city income tax. Is it unpatriotic for somebody to move from California to Texas, or California to Nevada, or New York to Florida? Is that unpatriotic? so that you can save that 10.3% California state income tax or that 9.9% Oregon state tax, et cetera, on this map? Is that an unpatriotic thing to do? You're still in the United States, you're just as maybe it's unpatriotic to California, but we're sort of told part of the brainwashing is that propaganda it tells us it's your patriotic duty to pay taxes, but it's okay if you screw over your state, just as long as you don't screw over the country, which is kind of a weird thing. It's the same thing, in Canada has the same thing. Is it unpatriotic to move from Alberta, for example? This is a chart if you're watching the video on their goods and service tax, basically their sales tax, their harmonized taxes. I couldn't find one for income tax, but for example, Nova Scotia, I think, has something like a 22% marginal tax rate, highest marginal tax rate, or you go to Alberta where they have a 10% flat tax. So is it unpatriotic if you're Canadian to move from Nova Scotia to Alberta to save 11, 12% on your taxes? You're still in the same country. You're just, you're moving from one place to the other. I don't think people really view that as unpatriotic. Okay, so there's another interesting example. What about the European Union? You have places like Bulgaria where they have a flat tax in Bulgaria. You can pay basically 10% in Bulgaria. Or you can pay you can pay French taxes, German taxes, Spanish taxes, Italian taxes. These are substantially higher. I mean, they have this millionaires penalty in France where they're trying to drive away as many wealthy people as they can. Gerard Depardieu was a famous example of this, but there's a lot of people that have basically left France over this. And again, the interesting thing about this is that these European politicians have tried to cobble together this sort of loose confederation of independent states into what we call the European Union. And so there's a free right to move between one country to the other. Is it unpatriotic? Is it anti-European to move from one European state to another European state? This is sort of an interesting thought experiment, and we can take this a bit further. Again, when you look at, now you move across to the entire world, and you can see there are places, this is an interesting chart about the effective income tax and Social Security rates on $300,000 in gross income. And you can see, you've got a place like, oh, what a surprise, France is at, nearly the very top. And then you've got places, I mentioned actually Bulgaria, way down on the other end, Macau, Kuwait, Hong Kong, even Ukraine. A lot of people don't realize Ukraine actually has a very low flat tax. Hong Kong, Singapore, all these places that we talk about, these are the low tax places. You go to a place like Hong Kong and you feel like, okay, I'm not really paying very much in taxes at all. I'm paying something, I'm paying a little bit, but it's very little, and I feel like what I'm getting in return, is great. There's this thing in the United States. Again, it goes back to that idea. Well, it's a privilege to pay taxes here because we're in this wonderful society and we have all these business opportunities and we're such a wealthy country, and so of course you have to pay more for that. Well, to be honest with you, I think that anybody who says that has probably never been outside of the country, because you get on a plane, you can go to Hong Kong and see, oh, guess what? This is just as advanced as the United States. It's just as wealthy on a per capita basis. You get to places like Singapore that are actually far more wealthy on a per capita basis. They have the exact same opportunities. They have a similar business environment. It's a much better business environment. It's transparent. It's easy to do business and so forth. But guess what? They're not paying the same amount. So they're getting more value and they're paying less money. So this whole argument about how it's a privilege and so forth, I think is very hollow, it's very empty, and it's very misinformed. It's an erroneous argument that's based on propaganda and not based on fact. Because if you look at fact, and again, at Sovereign Man, we're always looking at fact, and the fact is, you look at these other countries, and you're getting a lot more value, and you're paying a lot less for it. Again, there's price and there's value. Interesting opportunities even within the United States. This is a picture of Puerto Rico. We've talked about this really over the last year. In Puerto Rico, there's a very interesting set of tax legislation, tax incentive legislation, basically. They passed a couple of laws, some of which make it possible for somebody to relocate their business from the United States mainland into Puerto Rico. So in the same way that somebody moves, can move themselves or their business from California to Texas or to Florida, for example, and not have any sort of state income tax, you can actually move to Puerto Rico, because guess what? Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They have the right to go to the U.S. U.S. people on the mainland, if you're born in the U.S. and you're a U.S. citizen, you can move to Puerto Rico. It's not a foreign country. It's part of the United States. And in doing so, Puerto Rico actually has its own special tax code. In a way, it's sort of like Quebec is to the rest of Canada. It's like Hong Kong is to China. They have their own system. They have their own tax code. And for a number of years, Puerto Rican taxes were just as high, if not higher, even than on the U.S. mainland. But now they have these special incentives where you can go to Puerto Rico and pay, in some cases, 0%, 3%, 4% on your money, on your profits, on your capital gains, and so forth. And so again, is it unpatriotic to move from California to Texas to get rid of your state income tax? I would say no. But on the same line, why would it be unpatriotic to move from Texas or Florida, where you're not paying any state income tax, and move to Puerto Rico, where now you're not even paying state income tax, you're not even paying U.S. federal taxes. Now you're only paying 4% to Puerto Rico. Is that unpatriotic? Or how about we take that a step further and say, well, why not 0? And there's a lot of, if you're Canadian, for example, you can move just about anywhere in the world. And if you're outside of Canada, you're not paying taxes at all to the Canadian government. If you're a non-resident citizen of Canada, so you're a citizen of Canada, but you're not living there, and there's official declarations and so forth, but you can live in a place like, this is a picture of Panama. And in Panama, they have a territorial tax system. So if you're living in Panama, but you're not actually earning your money in Panama, then you have an effective tax rate of 0. You're not paying money that you don't earn. You're not paying taxes on money that you don't earn in Panama. So now you've moved outside of your country. You're not paying any more taxes. Is that unpatriotic? Again, I would argue no, that it's not unpatriotic. This is something where U.S. citizens unfortunately fall very, very short, because even U.S. citizens who move outside of the United States still have to pay taxes to the U.S. government. This is the United States is almost alone in the world. I say almost because there's very, very, very few countries that have this. One of them, ironically, is Eritrea. Who would have thought that Eritrea taxes its citizens on their worldwide income, no matter where they live in the world? I met a young lady, maybe it was 2 years ago, who was from Eritrea. And we were in Norway, and we were sitting in a coffee shop and with a couple of friends, and I said, oh, you know what, you and I have something in common. And she said, what? I said, our government taxes both on our worldwide income, no matter where we live. And she didn't really get it, and she didn't understand, and it didn't really matter to her, because, of course, there is no IRS in Eritrea that's going to chase her around or throw her in jail. So this is something that, again, is almost distinctly American. So in the land of the free, no matter where you go in the world, you still you get a certain allowance every year that's tax-free, and anything above and beyond that, you have to pay the same percentage of your worldwide income to the U.S. government, whether you live there or not. So talk about price and value disparity, right? So now the price is there, and your value is basically 0, because what value is there? You're not getting those, quote, services that you're paying for. So now there's a tremendous disparity, and this is something that a lot of people. This is one of the reasons why there's so many people that are walking away from their U.S. citizenship. This is why there's such a huge move to people saying, you know what, I'm finished with this. I've been living outside the country for so long. I'm sick of filing these tax forms. I'm sick of these people chasing me around and telling me that I'm a bad person and making me feel guilty because I'm living in London and I have a bank account in in Gibraltar, and and having this continue to pay and pay and pay and pay and not getting anything for it. I'm so tired of this, and so people leave. They leave. And this has been a huge movement. Every quarter we talk about these numbers. The new numbers will be coming out probably in another 2 months or so. And it's a really astounding increase. This is something that a couple of years ago, you might get 40, 50, 60 people, and now there's like 1,000 every quarter. And of course, big deal. You talk about 1,000 people out of 310 million, 320 million people in the United States. It's obviously embryonic, but the growth rates cannot be ignored, because again, when U.S. citizens move anywhere in the world and they still get taxed on their worldwide income, that's a massive price value disparity. And so in order to get to that point where they say, hey, look, this is crazy. I'm living in Panama. I'm living in Hong Kong. I'm living in Dubai. I'm living in one of these low tax places, but I'm just still getting killed on my U.S. taxes. I'm not getting any value for it. It almost forces them. It puts them in a position where they have to divorce themselves from their country. And frankly, that's a little bit sad when tax policy is so onerous and so debilitating that it forces people to divorce themselves from their country. But to be perfectly frank, this isn't anything that's out of the ordinary. There are a lot of historical norms for this, including the American Revolution itself, which again, as I mentioned earlier, was probably one of the largest tax-motivated divorces in history. It just happened to be a whole lot more people. We're in a phase of what I call taxation without consideration. Okay, because we all have representation, no matter where you are. If you're British, if you're Canadian, if you're American, if you're Australian, we all get taxed. We all have representation. So theoretically, we can go to the voting booth, which is a completely absurd waste of time, and we can vote on a politician, and that politician is going to do absolutely nothing for us, and keep himself or herself in office at his or her own benefit at our expense. Taxation is like anything else, and that there's a cost and a benefit. And when the cost exceeds the benefit, it's time to make changes. It's a pretty simple thing. It goes with everything else. I mean, if you have a gym membership and you're paying $20 a month for it, and it's a huge gym and you like it, it's great, and there's a lot of cool people there and a lot of nice equipment, it's great, it's fine. If all of a sudden they jack up the price to $5,000 a month, the benefit's probably not going to exceed the cost, and I have a feeling that you would probably cancel. And a lot of things are like that in life. Taxation is really like anything else. There's a cost and there's a benefit, and we could again go to price and value, cost and benefit. Same thing basically. And when there's a huge gulf between price and value, huge gulf between cost and benefit, where the cost is substantially higher, the price is substantially higher than the value, again, it's really time to make changes. People have been doing this for millennia. We're in a position now, again, where we have taxation with representation, but it is without consideration. There's no consideration about how they spend these funds. They go, oh, well, we're the largest country in the world. We should be able to bomb anybody we want. Let's have war. Let's have NSA. Let's have all these things and waste. And even after we tax people more than they've ever been taxed in history, let's still go into debt to the tune of $17.5 trillion. There's no consideration there. And again, you have to really ask the question, do we have some sort of fundamental are we born as human beings free, or are we born with obligations to politicians and central bankers? I would argue that we're born free, that we don't have any obligations, that we're not born with the requirement to serve others, that we have to go our entire lives serving some politician and central banker because they tell us through a lifelong digest of propaganda that it is our patriotic duty to continue to pay taxes, whatever they think those are, in their sole discretion, so that we can continue to finance wasteful spending without any consideration whatsoever. I think this is an absurd mentality, and again, people have been ditching this for millennia. It's not unpatriotic. It is the natural human condition to be born free, and when you find yourself in some kind of financial bondage, it is a natural human reaction to rise up, cut those chains, and do something about it. Whether that's moving, whether that's moving some assets, whether that's moving some income, etc. Nobody has an obligation to indefinitely finance waste and fraud and warfare and drones and domestic spying programs and all these things, and that's where taxes go. And I've often, told people that the most effective thing, if anybody really wants to make a change, the most effective thing they can do is vote with their feet. That's what people do when they go from California to Texas, when they go from Nova Scotia to Alberta. That's what people are fundamentally doing. They're saying, "What is my one vote going to do? I've got an election coming up where I've got an idiot versus an imbecile." And I've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people that are going to vote. What does my one vote count? It doesn't at all. You can vote with your feet. You can vote with your savings. You can vote with your dollars, your euros, your yen, your pounds, whatever it is. You can vote with all of those things, and it is a far, far more powerful statement to make. Solutions do exist. These are things we talk about in many cases in our premium content. Obviously, if you're a member of Sovereign Man Confidential, you understand this. Our ethos is very simple. When every shred of objective evidence suggests that your home country is in decline, then maybe it's time to diversify. Maybe it's time that you consider moving a portion of your assets, your interests, your income, etc. abroad. If your government is broke, and in this idea of sort of taxation without consideration is the rule, where they feel like they can do anything they want, they can indebt everybody they want, they can take as much as they want, they can raise taxes, they can blow all the money on cash for clunkers and bailing out banks and bailing out insurance companies and dropping bombs in foreign countries and all these things, and that's what they spend your money on. That's what they spend the money on. If that's the situation in your home country, then you can take steps to legitimately reduce your tax burden. And this, in a way, sort of starves the beast. When you vote with your feet, when you vote with your dollars, you vote with your euros and your yen and your pounds, etc., that starves the beast. and actually accelerates the decline. That's the best possible outcome, is to just be done with it already. Why wait around another 5, 10 years, however long it takes for these people to finally collapse, or they get to the point where they can't, 100% of their tax revenue is going just to pay interest. Why wait around for that? The best outcome almost is to accelerate that as quickly as possible. If your banking system is insolvent, and of course I bring this up because the Federal Reserve just published these stress tests the other day. It turns out many of the largest banks in the land of the free, failed their stress tests. They failed. They're not solvent enough. And this is where thousands, millions of people hold their savings in this insolvent banking system. And if that's the case, and guess what? You can actually move some of your savings abroad. Why wouldn't you do that? Why would you consciously, willfully hold the entirety of your savings in an insolvent bank, in an insolvent banking system that's backed up by an insolvent central bank that's supported by an insolvent government? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. If your currency is on a one-way trip to junk status, again, because your central bank is insolvent, the issuer of your currency is insolvent, well, guess what? You can do something about that. You can hold foreign currencies. You can hold precious metals, all these things that aren't controlled by your central bankers and your politicians. You can do these things. And again, the whole point of all this is that your income, your savings, your investments, your business, your email, your digital assets, your medical care, your insurance, your estate planning vehicles, your retirement account. If you're a charitable giver, you can set up personal foundations, all this stuff. All these assets and interests and income and livelihood and all these things together, they don't have to live in the same place that you do. So even if you're living in Texas or California or Nova Scotia or whatever, and you're looking at this going, wow, this is just getting out of control, this is crazy, and you have your home and your business and your employees and your suppliers and all of your contracts and your retirement account and your digital, your Dropbox and all these things, and they're all basically living with you together in the same country. Your neighbors are your assets. All of your savings and all of your investments and everything is right there in the exact same place where you live. Then you're really taking a lot of risk, particularly if you can just look at the objective considerations and say, wow, this place is really on the decline. Of course, it's the emotion, right? The propaganda tells us, oh, everything's going to be fine. We've been through tough. We quote we. The country been through tougher times, and we're going to pull out of this just fine, and so forth. But if you look at the objective data, it tells a completely different story. And it makes all the sense in the world, again, when you've got insolvent banking system, insolvent government, insolvent central bank, you've got rising taxes and more regulation, all this stuff. And I'm not making this up. This is all publicly available information. These are their own numbers. Again, the government, the GAO, the U.S. government's own numbers say that their assets minus liabilities, their net worth is minus $17 trillion. These aren't even my own calculations. My calculations would be actually far worse. Because their unfunded liabilities would have to be counted differently. But that's besides the point. Again, this is all publicly available information. And so when all the information says that this place is on the decline, wherever you happen to be, again, we talk about insolvency. The Central Bank of Canada is actually more insolvent than any other bank in the West. You look at these places in the UK and Canada in particular have actually specifically passed legislation and/or proposed legislation to say that if the banks get into trouble, guess what? They'll just take the money from the depositors. Exactly what they did in Cyprus a year ago. Almost a year ago to the day. This is exactly what they did in Cyprus. Is when the banks became insolvent, they just grabbed the depositors' money, and there's bills either passed or on the table in many other places in the West that they do the exact same thing. It really begs the question, why would you continue holding your money in this kind of insolvent system, in this insolvent banking system, in a currency that's managed and controlled by an insolvent central bank, etc.? None of this makes any sense if you take a rational, objective view. So and there are options, again, because your income and your savings and your investment and your business and all these things do not need to live in the same place. You do not have an obligation to continue to support indefinitely with your own sweat and your own labor and your own intellectual capacity and your own creativity. You have absolutely no obligation to continue to support this bankrupt and corrupt and declining system. You have no obligation to that because you are born free. And your obligation is to your family and not to some politician who lies and spreads false promises and central bankers that conjure money out of thin air in their sole discretion for the benefit of the banking elite at the expense of everybody else. You have no obligation, even though the propaganda tells you otherwise. In our instincts as human beings, we are born free. I really want to thank you for listening. Next week, I'm actually going to be talking to a good friend of mine who actually took this all the way to its conclusion, and he actually renounced his U.S. citizenship. It's a very interesting story, and I want to tell you more about that. For a lot of people, again, this is the most radical thing they could possibly imagine, but we'll talk more about that. It's a very uncomfortable, and again, in many cases, very radical conversation, but that's what we're going to talk about next week. And if you're a guest and you haven't heard from us before, again, you can get more information. We've got a lot of really great resources, many free resources at our website, sovereignman.com, as well as past podcast episodes. And, if you're somebody who's interested in taking action and getting the right information, the highest quality information you can, we've got a lot of really great products on our website. So we'll look forward to seeing you there, and we'll talk to you again next week.